The air was thick with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, and the morning sunlight streamed through the windows, bathing the small cafe near Fort Carson, Colorado in a warm glow. Inside, the sounds of military families reconnecting and locals catching up filled the space, blending with the clink of cups and the hum of idle chatter. But in the midst of it all sat a young black soldier, his uniform crisp, each patch on his arm a testament to years of dedication. He was a quiet figure, his focus entirely on the steaming cup in front of him. His posture was calm, almost stoic, yet there was a quiet strength radiating from him, an inner resolve that contrasted with the bustle around him. But not everyone shared the same sense of calm. A woman, seated just a few tables away, kept stealing glances in his direction, her irritation growing more visible with every passing second. Her lips pressed into a tight line, her fingers tapping impatiently on the surface of her table. Finally, she couldn't hold back anymore. "Excuse me," she called, her voice slicing through the air, sharp enough to still the room for a moment. "Do you really think you should be wearing that uniform?" The soldier looked up, his gaze meeting hers with an expression that was neither defensive nor angry, but steady, almost detached. It was as if he could sense the storm brewing in her words, but he refused to let it rattle him. The cafe seemed to freeze, the sounds of conversation stuttering to a halt. All eyes shifted toward the two of them. Her voice rose, each word punctuated with an increasing edge. "It's people like you who make a mockery of that uniform. What could you possibly know about representing this country?" The tension in the room thickened, palpable. A young mother, her toddler clutched protectively in her arms, cast a fleeting glance at the soldier before looking away, discomfort written all over her face. In the corner, an elderly man flipped his newspaper without meeting anyone's gaze. But still, the soldier remained unmoved, his hands resting calmly on the table, his eyes betraying nothing but a quiet hurt. He wasn't being judged for what he had done, but for something he could not control, something that made him feel small in this moment. Yet the woman wasn't done. She leaned in, her words sharper than before, cutting through the heavy silence. "I just don't see how someone like you could possibly understand what it means to serve, to defend the values of this country. People like you don't belong in that uniform." Her voice was thick with disdain, sending a ripple of unease through the cafe. Patrons exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort growing, but still no one spoke up. The soldier's posture didn't falter. His hands rested like stone on the table, his eyes unwavering as he watched her. The air grew heavier, thick with the weight of her words. Behind the counter, the barista faltered, her hand trembling as the coffee overflowed onto the saucer. An elderly couple sitting by the window exchanged glances, the woman's eyes narrowing in judgment, while her husband, his jaw set tight, quietly returned to his meal. Finally, the soldier broke the silence. His voice, when it came, was calm but firm, carrying an authority that silenced the room. "Ma'am," he began, his tone steady, "I hear what you're saying, but you don't know anything about me, about what I've done, or why I wear this uniform." His words hung in the air like a challenge that left the room still and waiting. The woman scoffed, her arms folding across her chest, her expression hardened. "Oh, I'm sure you have some story to tell," she said dismissively. "But that doesn't change the fact that you—" She gestured toward him with a contemptuous flick of her hand. "Don't represent what this uniform stands for. You can't." Her words lingered like a toxic cloud, but the soldier didn't flinch. Slowly, deliberately, he stood. The scrape of his chair against the floor echoed, cutting through the stillness, commanding attention. He straightened, adjusting his collar with a practiced motion, taking a deep breath. The kind of breath that came from years of training, from knowing that in moments like this, composure was everything. "You're right about one thing," he began, his voice rising, yet still measured. "I do have a story to tell, and maybe you, and everyone else here, should hear it." He paused, the room holding its collective breath, the tension taut in the air. Before the woman could respond, before she could fold her arms once more and challenge him, the soldier's gaze swept over the patrons. One by one, his eyes met theirs, calm, unwavering, as if he were silently daring them to look away. "I enlisted right out of high school," he began, his voice clear and steady. "I was 18, from a small town in Texas. My parents taught me to work hard, respect others, and believe in the values this country was built on." He paused again, the emotion in his words now becoming clear. "I didn't join the military for recognition or to prove a point. I joined because I believed in protecting the freedoms we all take for granted." The cafe had fallen completely silent, all eyes on him. Even the barista, who had been nervously wiping down a countertop, stopped in her tracks, her hands gripping the towel so tightly her knuckles whitened. He continued, the weight of his words sinking deeper into the room. "I've served 2 tours overseas," he said, his tone unwavering. "In Afghanistan, I lost friends, good men and women who didn't care what I looked like or where I came from. All they cared about was whether I had their back. And I did. Every single time." There was a shift in the room. The discomfort of the patrons began to soften into something else, curiosity, maybe even guilt. The woman, who had been so brash just moments ago, no longer seemed so sure of herself. Her arms were no longer crossed, her posture rigid, but her face was pale. "There was a village," the soldier continued, his voice growing quieter now, softer. "A bomb had gone off, and we were called in to help. I carried a little girl, she couldn't have been more than 6, out of the rubble. Her parents didn't survive, but she did. I made sure of that." A faint murmur rippled through the cafe. Someone cleared their throat, a chair shifted. All eyes were now on him. "Do you know what she said to me?" he asked, his gaze locking with the woman's. She stared back, wide-eyed, as the gravity of his words hit her. "She didn't thank me for being a soldier. She thanked me for being kind. For saving her life when no one else could." His voice hardened, carrying an undeniable weight. "So when you say I don't represent this uniform, you're not just insulting me. You're insulting every person I've stood beside, every family I've comforted, and every child I've fought to protect. This uniform isn't about who wears it. It's about what it stands for. And I've earned the right to wear it. Just like anyone else who has served." The woman's face drained of color, her bravado slipping away like sand through her fingers. The soldier wasn't finished yet. "You don't have to like me," he said firmly, his gaze never wavering. "You don't even have to respect me. But you will not question my service or my right to be here." He fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air, leaving the room to absorb the raw power of what he had shared. His presence commanded a respect that words alone could never capture. The silence in the room stretched on, thick and heavy. Then, a man in his early 60s, seated near the counter, broke it. His voice cracked with emotion as he spoke, "Thank you." The words hung in the air, thick with gratitude. "For your service. For everything you've done." The soldier, unshaken, gave a slight nod, acknowledging the man's sentiment, but his composure remained unwavering, steadfast. It was as if his mere being carried more weight than any applause. At first, the man's words seemed like a spark in the dark, tentative but bright. A young woman, wearing a floral dress and sitting near the corner, hesitantly added, "He's right." Her voice, once unsure, now gathered strength. "It's not about what someone looks like. It's about what they've done. Who they are." An older woman, gripping her purse tightly, chimed in. "Exactly," she said, her voice firm with conviction. "I can't even imagine what he's been through. It's shameful anyone would question that." The air in the cafe began to shift, as if the very walls themselves were breathing a collective sigh. The tension, once suffocating, was slowly replaced with a quiet solidarity. People who had once been passive observers now leaned forward, their posture open, their faces softened with understanding. But the woman who had sparked the conflict still sat frozen, her hands trembling as she fidgeted with her napkin. Her gaze flickered between the table and the soldier, and it wasn't clear if she was battling with shame, regret, or simple shock. The soldier didn't move to sit down just yet. Instead, he took a step back toward his chair, but his focus remained on the woman. His voice was gentle but firm. "I didn't share my story to humiliate you," he said, his words like a quiet force. "I shared it because I believe we're better than this. Because I know we can be." His eyes never left hers, as if willing her to see the truth in his words. And as she lowered her head, his voice seemed to echo in the room, not just directed at her but to everyone present. The woman, her gaze fixed on the napkin in her hands, twisted it into folds. She seemed unaware of how much she had changed, how her once bold demeanor had dissolved into something smaller, quieter. Her gaze flickered up to meet the soldier's, just for a fleeting moment, before quickly dropping again. And then, for the first time, her voice faltered. I didn't mean," her words were broken, almost foreign to her. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. I didn't know what you've been through." Her voice was softer now, a shadow of the harshness that had once filled the space between them. The patrons around her observed in silence, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and quiet approval. The soldier's face remained calm, an unwavering mask of composure. He didn't need to say anything more. His story had already done the talking. I shouldn't have assumed, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what I thought. She paused, her hands now gripping the edge of the table. I guess I let my own feelings get in the way of seeing you for who you really are. Her words, though hesitant, carried a weight that seemed to settle in the air, thick with sincerity. The woman glanced around the cafe, as though seeing it with new eyes, aware for the first time that she wasn't just speaking to the soldier, but to everyone in the room. The older man by the counter who had thanked the soldier earlier gave a small nod of encouragement. A young boy, sitting with his mother, whispered something to her, and she smiled softly, patting his hand. The woman turned back to the soldier, her voice trembling. I'm sorry, she said, finally, the words thick with remorse. I really am. The soldier studied her for a moment, his gaze steady but unyielding. His expression didn't change. Then, with a small, simple nod, he spoke. Apology accepted. It was a quiet acknowledgement, but the weight of it was profound. The woman exhaled, as if she had just released a breath she had been holding for too long. The tension in the room seemed to dissolve, leaving behind something deeper, something shared. A young man, standing near the entrance, spoke up. It takes guts to admit when you're wrong, he said, his voice kind, but firm. And it takes even more to stand up for what's right. The woman offered a faint, grateful smile but said no more. She picked up her coffee, her hand still trembling slightly, and took a sip. Though the soldier remained silent, his presence alone reminded everyone in the room of what true courage looked like. The atmosphere in the cafe had shifted, no longer tense, but filled with a palpable sense of unity. Conversations began to flow again, but this time they were different, softer, more thoughtful. People exchanged glances of understanding, as if they had witnessed something profound, something that had reminded them of the humanity we all share. An elderly woman, seated near the window, stood up and made her way toward the soldier. Her steps were slow but deliberate. When she reached him, she extended her hand. Thank you, she said, her voice firm yet filled with emotion. My husband served in Vietnam. I know the weight of that uniform, and I know you carry it with honor. The soldier shook her hand, offering a small but genuine smile. Thank you, ma'am, he replied, his voice warm and sincere. This simple exchange seemed to open the floodgates. One by one, other patrons approached the soldier. Some thanked him for his service, while others shared brief stories of family members who had served. Each gesture added to the growing sense of camaraderie in the room. Even the barista, who had remained quiet throughout the ordeal, stepped forward. She placed a fresh cup of coffee on the soldier's table. This one's on the house, she said, with a smile. It's the least I can do. The soldier nodded in gratitude, meeting her gaze briefly before sitting back down. Meanwhile, the woman who had sparked the confrontation remained at her table, watching everything unfold. Her earlier defiance was gone, replaced by a quiet introspection. She didn't speak anymore, but her body language spoke volumes, her shoulders had relaxed, and her head was slightly bowed. As the cafe settled into a peaceful rhythm, the soldier glanced around, taking in the people who had approached him. It wasn't just their words that struck him. It was the shared understanding that had emerged from such a tense moment. Across the room, a teenage girl whispered to her father, "Why would anyone question him? He's a hero." Her father nodded thoughtfully, but didn't answer. The soldier finished his coffee, his movements slow and unhurried, as if savoring the moment. When he stood to leave, several patrons offered final words of thanks. The young mother who had shielded her child earlier smiled warmly at him. "Take care," she said softly, her child waving goodbye from his booster seat. The soldier tipped his head slightly, his expression calm but kind. "You too," he replied. And as he stepped outside, the cafe felt lighter, transformed, not just by his story, but by the collective reminder of what it means to see the humanity in each other.